LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've picked out 28 of the weekend's best clips for what should be a great show for you all tonight. As usual, my clips come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. And as usual, I'll also have some political comedy clips for you from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher from last Friday night. And also next week, when Saturday Night Live returns, I may have some weekend political comedy from there as well. As for this week's topics, you can see all the topics I'm covering listed down in the video description. And if you're watching this as a recorded version of the show, you should see time indexes down there, and you can use those to skip to the topics that interest you the most. Also, I'm trying something new this week. Whether you're watching the show as a live or recorded show, I've put a link down in the video description to my public Patreon page where you can download the ordered list of the 28 clips I'm using. You know, sometimes I look at this page, and this is the list I use, and it also lets you know all 28 clips in order if you can decode my notes to myself, which are sometimes a little unintelligible. As for the order of the clips, this week I'm going to start with what may have been the biggest news of the week, the resignation of Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner. Then I'll move to the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign again. This week, mercifully, almost no Donald Trump, but there were other Republican candidates on the morning shows, including a few clips of Dr. Ben Carson, who's now basically tied as the Republican frontrunner. And he defended his comments about Muslims from last week until someone from his campaign actually abruptly ended one of the interviews, so look for that. After the 11 clips on the Republican side of the presidential campaign, I'll have about, I think it's 7 on the Democratic side, mostly this week coming from Hillary Clinton's second Sunday morning news show interview, this time with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. But I'll also have a couple clips of Senator Bernie Sanders this week. He did an interview over on CBS too, so at least this week there'll be some Bernie Sanders. Next I'll have a couple clips on the overcovered Pope visit story, and then a couple clips on the undercovered meetings between President Obama and Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping from China. Then finally a bonus clip on Bill Maher showing his Islamophobia again in reaction to that 14-year-old Muslim American high school student Ahmed Mohamed, who was arrested and suspended for bringing a clock to school. Bill Maher revisited the topic on his show this week, and I'll have one clip at the very end of the show on that topic. But first, I want to start with the way Bill Maher dealt in his monologue with the way the visit from the Pope actually connected up with another big news story of the week over here.
Now, I think I know why you're happy, because the Pope came to Washington and cast John Boehner out. No, so John Boehner, I love announcements on a Friday. We get at it first. Yes, absolutely, John Boehner stepping down as the Speaker of the House, and liberals cheer like that. But you know what? Don't be so happy. This is the Republican Party. It always gets worse. We thought Bush was the worst, and then Sarah Palin came along, and then Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. The new speaker is going to be, Representative Hillbilly Quasimodo. And his platform of permitting guns and maternity wards. And rescinding the no shirt, no shoe rule in Congress. That's what you're going to get next.
Now, I think Bill Maher may have a point there about what replaces John Boehner as Speaker of the House, or who replaces John Boehner as Speaker of the House, and especially the leadership team under the new leader, who the new Speaker of the House is probably going to be Kevin McCarthy from California, but they're reordering the leadership team to maybe give the Tea Party a little more power, and that's at least the gist of the I got from the guests on the shows. Before I get to a couple of those guests, I want to show a report that John Carl did on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, reporting on the resignation of John Boehner and some of his career, putting it kind of in some historical context, and also giving some of the latest news over here.
God bless you, Speaker Boehner.
It was the Tea Party wave in 2010 that made John Boehner Speaker of the House. He had spoken their language in the fight over Obamacare.
Hell no, you can't!
Hell no soon became the de facto motto of the House conservatives, who often made Boehner's life as Speaker a political hell and ultimately did him in. He faced an ugly fight just to keep his job.
This turmoil that's been churning now for a couple of months is not good for the members, and it's not good for the institution.
Speaker Boehner announced that he will be resigning.
At a forum of conservative voters in Washington Friday, Boehner's resignation got a standing ovation. The same anti-establishment forces that are shaking up Congress have also upended the race for the White House. The surest way for Republicans running for president to gain points is by slamming Republicans running Congress.
They get elected, they're full of vim and vigor, they're going to change things. They come down to these magnificent vaulted ceilings that you see all over Washington, and what happens? They become different people.
Ultimately, John Boehner was the top leader in a Congress unwilling to be led.
I'm not surprised the Pope inspired Boehner to resign. It must have been difficult for the Republican leader to sit there and watch someone whose followers actually listen to him.
The visit of Pope Francis was the emotional high point of Boehner's tenure. The former altar boy had been trying to get a pope to address Congress for 20 years.
I have the high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you Pope Francis of the Holy See.
It was also the moment that prompted his big decision.
I woke up and I said my prayers, as I always do, and I decided, today's the day I'm going to do this.
After announcing his resignation, Boehner seemed a changed man.
Zippity-doo-dah, zippity.
And why not sing? The challenge of leading that unruly Republican majority will soon be someone else's problem. For This Week, Jonathan Karl, ABC News, Washington.
So that was a good background report from ABC on Speaker of the House John Boehner's career and what led him to resign. But if you want to see a much more in-depth answer as to why he resigned, I'm going to show you this next clip from CBS's Face the Nation. Speaker of the House John Boehner was actually a guest, and John Dickerson asked him specifically, why he resigned. And actually, if you look at my little clip list here, it will tell you that it's a John Dickerson versus John Boehner asking if him leaving means that the Republican Party is in dysfunction or is dysfunctional. And John Boehner says, no, not dysfunctional, just that there are disagreements. And he was going to leave anyway, and why go through the leadership problem? And then John Dickerson actually follows up about that leadership problem. And that is my, if you looked at that link down in the video description to my note number for the third clip, that is how I, if you want to decode what that means, that's what John Dickerson asked John Boehner, and he explained over in this clip.
Before the next person gets there.
Well, let's talk about the state of the barn and its relative cleanliness. A lot of your colleagues I've talked to and friends who served with you use the word dysfunction and say basically that you had to resign because it's a sign of how dysfunctional things are in the House with Republicans. What do you say to that?
Well, I wouldn't call it dysfunction. Disagreement, yes. But as I said on Friday, I was planning on leaving at the end of last year. And when my friend Eric Cantor lost his primary election in July of last year, it was clear to me that I just couldn't leave, that I had to provide a transition for the next leaders. So I planned on serving through this year. And on November 17th, I was going to make an announcement. And on Thursday evening and Friday morning, I looked up and went, why do I want to put my colleagues through this when I'm going to make the same announcement 6 weeks from now? Why do I want to put the institution through this? And so it was the right decision. Frankly, I thought we handled it the right way.
When you talk about the decision that they were going to have to go through, it was going to be a pretty messy...
Yeah, a motion to vacate the chair.
Yeah,
so
kick you out of your job, just sorry, to help people at home who don't understand what vacating the chair is.
Listen, winning that vote was never an issue. I was going to get the overwhelming number of, I'd have gotten 400 votes probably. But why do I want to make my members, Republican members, like walk the plank? because they're going to get criticized at home by some who think that we ought to be more aggressive. Listen, we've accomplished a lot over the 4.5 years that I was Speaker. And whether it was the largest deficit reduction deal in the history of the country, saving $2.1 trillion, protecting 99% of the American people from an increase in our taxes, or the first major entitlement reforms in 20 years. All done over the last 4.5 years with a Democrat president, and all voted against by my most conservative members because it wasn't good enough. Really? This is the part that I really don't understand. You know, our founders gave us the system of government, a majority in the House, you need 60 votes in the Senate. Then, if the House and Senate can agree, the president gets to decide. And our founders didn't want some parliamentary system where if you won the majority, you got to do whatever you wanted. They wanted this long, slow process. And so change comes slowly, and obviously too slowly for some.
Well, are they unrealistic about what can be done in government? That's the dysfunction.
Absolutely, they're unrealistic. But the Bible says beware of false prophets. And there are people out there, spreading noise about how much can get done. I mean, this whole idea that we're going to shut down the government to get rid of Obamacare in 2013, this plan never had a chance. But over the course of the August recess in 2013 and the course of September, a lot of my Republican colleagues who knew it was a fool's errand, really they were getting all this pressure from home to do this. And so we got groups here in town, members of the House and Senate here in town, who whip people into a frenzy believing that they can accomplish things that they know are never going to happen. It's just, but listen, I've had 25 great years here in Washington. I've had great staff, I've had great colleagues, and I'm very thankful to my family and to my constituents for giving me the honor to do this.
Is Ted Cruz a false prophet?
Listen, you can pick a lot of names out. I'll let you choose them.
You don't debate that assertion?
I'll refer you to my remark at a fundraiser I made in August in Steamboat.
Sorry, I cut that out. Steamboat Springs is what he said there at the end. He's referring to a remark he made about Ted Cruz in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, in the last couple months, where he called Senator Ted Cruz a jackass. And actually, John Dickerson clarifies that with Speaker John Boehner a little later in the interview. So on his way out, he's calling Senator Ted Cruz a jackass for, engineering these government shutdowns and getting these Tea Party Republicans to follow him. And there are like 29 of them, I think, in the current House of Representatives, and that's what made it, or I think 29 votes was the threshold where he would lose. I don't know exactly, but the numbers. But the next person I want to show is one of those Tea Party Republicans who is basically happy that Speaker John Boehner is gone. There was a back and forth on Fox News Sunday. They had both a Tea Party Republican to criticize John Boehner, and then they had another Republican who was a member of John Boehner's leadership team. First, here's the Tea Party Republican. His name is Mick Mulvaney, Representative Mick Mulvaney, and he gets a question from Chris Wallace about, first they show a clip of John Boehner, and then you'll see Chris Wallace ask Mick Mulvaney, why Boehner was bad, and did he get forced out by the Tea Party over in this clip.
Good to be with you.
Let's start with how Speaker Boehner described his decision to step down. Here it is.
It's become clear to me that this prolonged leadership turmoil would do irreparable harm to the institution.
Congressman Mulvaney, what was wrong with Boehner as Speaker, and did your hardline faction of House Republicans, did you force him out?
Well, what was wrong? We stopped being a co-equal branch of government. I had a farmer come into my office a couple weeks ago and tell a story about how he had to get down on his knees and beg an EPA regulator regarding some things to do with farm ponds. That's sad in a country where a farmer has to come in and do that kind of stuff. Congress used to be able to fight back against that. We used to use the power of the purse to help folks like that against an overreaching administration. We've stopped. We don't use the power of the purse anymore. The Senate uses the filibuster instead of the power of the purse. And yeah, it had to change. It absolutely had to change.
And did you force him out? You and your hardline colleagues?
I think the 72% of Republican primary voters who didn't approve of his job probably forced him out more than anything.
So, like I said, that was the Tea Party side of the argument, and then the guy who was sitting next to Representative Mick Mulvaney was Representative Tom Coles, who was a member of Speaker John Boehner's leadership, and you can see his rebuttal to what Representative Mick Mulvaney said over in this clip.
Congressman Cole, your response to that?
Well, first of all, in terms of the EPA, it's just not true. The budget's been cut by 21%. They're operating at 1989 staffing levels. So the power of the purse has been used, and there are restrictions as to what they can do. In terms of the larger question on the Speaker, look, he's had to fight for 4 years with a Democratic president, most of the time with a Democratic Senate. Yet during that time, he's brought the deficit down by over $1 trillion. He made almost all the Bush tax cuts permanent. He got the first real entitlement reform for Medicare and Medicaid. In divided government, that's an extraordinary range of accomplishments. The sad thing is we have a lot of Republicans honestly telling Republican voters the problem up here are Republicans. The problem up here is Barack Obama and the Democrats, and we focus on that, we can get something done.
So that's basically the range of opinion in the Republican Party on Speaker John Boehner. You've got the Boehner loyalists who say the real problem is the Democrats, and then there are some Republicans who are willing to blame the leadership. And so that kind of leads me into the next topic that I'm going to cover, which is the Republican presidential field and the 2016 presidential campaign. The first clip I'm going to show is from Ohio Governor John Kasich responding to what John Boehner said. He was also on CBS's Face the Nation, and so he's responding to what John Boehner said earlier in the program about the false prophets who promise Republicans that they're going to, accomplish something with these aggressive tactics, but they know that they can't really deliver, like with the government shutdowns. And Governor John Kasich responds to that, and then he talks about himself as a reformer with results, and also about how he's doing really well in New Hampshire and coming up in Iowa, which is actually true of the establishment candidates. Scott Walker has dropped out, which is something John Dickerson brings up with John Kasich in this clip. And so the three, establishment conventional wisdom candidates left are John Kasich, governor of Ohio, Jeb Bush, who I'm going to show a couple clips from later, and who is the other conventional? Oh, Marco Rubio, who was not on any of the shows, although he's gotten in a big fight with Donald Trump this week. Senator Marco Rubio is actually doing better nationally than Jeb Bush and John Kasich. But I think in some ways John Kasich, the clip I'm about to show, Governor of Ohio John Kasich, has the best path to victory as an establishment candidate because he is doing well in New Hampshire and rising in Iowa. He, especially if he wins New Hampshire, he could use that as his moment to show the way that he is a kind of moderate Republican, sort of a compassionate conservative, like Jeb Bush is trying to be, but he doesn't have all the baggage of the Bush name. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after I show you how John Kasich responds to John Boehner's talk of false prophets and uses it to go into his campaign talking points about being a reformer with results in this clip.
What about his, in terms of why that's harder to do today, what role do you think what the group that he called were the false prophets in your own party, what role do you think the false prophets play in the current state of things?
Well, it's about inexperience. I mean, the people who keep saying that they want things to happen, what have they accomplished? What have they gotten done? They're serving in the Congress. Have they accomplished anything? When I served there, we achieved things. I achieved things. I was a reformer. I've been a reformer all of my lifetime. As you know, I shake up the system all the time. You know how much reform and change it took to balance the federal budget? I mean, I stepped on more toes than you can imagine. Coming to Ohio and reforming things out here, this state was about dead. Now we're doing well. People didn't think I could do it. You know how much we had to shake up? And so a lot of the people who were doing the complaining and saying, why isn't anything getting done? Maybe they ought to look in the mirror. What have they accomplished? I mean, are they just speech makers? Are they just people out there yelling and screaming? But John, I have to disagree with your panel. When I travel around this country, and I was just in South Carolina, I was in New York, in Boston, in Iowa, You know what? No, maybe people are yelling loud, but at the end of the day, people are now beginning to say, what can you do, Governor, to bring people together to accomplish things? So sometimes you hear loud voices out here they're the ones that get the attention and get the headlines. Right? I got to tell you, at the end of the day, I believe the Republican Party will pick somebody who is a reformer, who is a change agent, but who has accomplished things and have experience. So all these people yelling and screaming, you ask them, what have you accomplished for the time that you've been in public office? Be an interesting question, wouldn't it?
It would, and we appreciate your help there on the question asking front. Let me ask you this, though. Two of the people who are now out of the Republican race, they did stuff. Governor Perry, Governor Walker. They had accomplished things. They had experience. They are no longer able to run for president. So what does that say about the climate in which you're trying to make the case that you just made?
Well, there's three things you need to be president, in my opinion, said by a smart Democrat. One, you got to have issues. Two, you have to have vision. And three, you kind of have to be likable. You got to have at least two of those three. And, I think in regard to Scott Walker, he'll come back. He may be president someday. They just kind of got over their skis. They spent a lot of money and they ran out of money. You got to husband your resources. But what I have found, as you know, my campaign has gone on for slightly more than just 2 months, John. And I'm in the top tier in New Hampshire. I'm beginning to rise in Iowa. So if what I'm saying is not true, then I should be getting out of the race, which I am not, because I think we're making really good progress in connecting. But remember, people want change. They want reform. They want to see something done. But just carping about it and whining about it and making speeches about it doesn't get it done. America needs to solve problems. In some ways, it's even a national security issue. When the world looks at America being unable to solve problems, they kind of laugh at us, and then they worry, is America failing? We need to be able to solve problems in this country and send a message to the world.
And I don't know, I think that Governor of Ohio, John Kasich there, may have sort of the Reagan model of success in the Republican Party, where he tries to talk optimistically, although he certainly has some nasty conservative sides to him. It's not like I'm going to be voting for him anytime soon, but compared to the rest of the Republican candidates, like I said, he's trying to project the compassionate conservatism, the optimism, the, a rising tide raises all boats, or I don't know. I'm not showing his entire interview. In fact, that's the only John Kasich clip I'm going to show. But I wanted to bring up that Reagan comparison because the next clip I'm going to show is President Ronald Reagan's much more liberal son, Ron Reagan, over on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. This is actually in the overtime segment. I have a link down to the entire overtime segment in the video description. I think it's about 11 minutes long. This is about a 90-second segment of that overtime portion that's not broadcast, but it's just available on YouTube, where Ron Reagan talks about how Ronald Reagan never would have made it past the Tea Party conservative purity test that, the false prophets that Speaker John Boehner was talking about. And Ron Reagan, as the son of Ronald Reagan, of course, is very familiar with everything that Ronald Reagan did and has a great list of talking points about how he would no longer fit in the Republican Party. And I think if I remember, I think there's a fairly funny punchline by Bill Maher at the end, but I could be wrong about that, over in this clip.
Ron Reagan, what explains the Republicans' obsession with your father?
Well, he's better than Nixon, I guess, if you're going to have a year. I mean, who else do they have, really? But it's true. Every election cycle, they trot him out again. He's like a fetish object. They've all got to stroke the Gipper.
Well, yeah.
Ooh, stroke the Ronnie there. And then, of course, the question arises as to whether he would be welcome in today's Republican Party. And I think if you look at the record, when he was governor of California, signed a liberal abortion law. As president, he raised taxes after cutting them when he found out that raising them or cutting them didn't really work. Amnesty for 3 million immigrants.
Offered to get our nukes down to nothing with Gorbachev.
200 Marines killed in Lebanon in the barracks bombing. He did not go to war in Iraq.
Cut and ran.
Ran out of there, said let's get out. And when an ozone hole opens up over the South Pole, due to our putting chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, that was a refrigerant, of course.
Right.
He did not decide that this was a liberal hoax designed to deprive us of cold beer.
Right.
He actually did something about it.
Right.
You know, encourred everybody else to do so too. So on that basis, I would say
forgot
probably not
what a
welcome.
giant liberal Ronald Reagan
really?
was. Right.
You forget, don't you?
Well, I mean, he also said Medicare was socialism that would rob us of our freedom.
Well, he had his moments.
Yeah, he had his moments. But I mean...
So actually, it wasn't Bill Maher that had the funny lines in that clip. It was actually Ron Reagan who had 2 or 3 pretty funny lines in the middle of something you would think, as the son of Ronald Reagan, he's probably had a lot of practice making that argument, and I think he made it pretty well. So I wanted to show you that clip, and now I want to move on to the other Republican who's trying to be the establishment candidate. And as I promised, a little later on, you will see Dr. Ben Carson who is trying to be the non-establishment candidate. But first I want to have a couple clips of Jeb Bush. First I want to show how, and this is an exclusive interview over on Fox News Sunday, and I think he got fairly soft treatment from Chris Wallace, although I will show one somewhat confrontational question. But first I want to show the introduction that Chris Wallace gave, where he first talked about how, you know, he's dropped from first place to middle of the field, but he's gaining momentum. I remember from the introduction where I don't know where the evidence is that he's gaining any momentum. So that seemed like just something to add to make him seem a little more positive. And then the entire little introductory clip you'll see is meant to humanize Jeb Bush and show how great it is that he speaks Spanish with his Latino neighbors. And anyway, I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip over here.
But first, our exclusive interview with former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Since launching his campaign, Bush has gone from frontrunner to the middle of the pack. Now, he seems to be regaining his momentum. We traveled to his home base in Florida to catch up with him. Jeb Bush took us to a park in the Little Havana section of Miami, where people who fled Cuba decades ago come to play their traditional game of dominoes.
¿Quién está ganando?
They greeted him like an old friend, conversing comfortably in their native language, which has become an issue in this campaign. On the one hand, they speak Spanish, but they're good assimilated Americans, too.
Well, it's American life. The first generation comes, they sacrifice for their children, and their children end up becoming as American as anybody else. Sería importante. Gracias.
Then we went to a Bush field office to discuss a campaign that has been much tougher for the former governor than many expected.
But we need Jeb.
Oh, sorry. Oh, and did you see that? That was like the tiny little bit of Trump that's going to be in the next question from the interview that Chris Wallace does with Jeb Bush there after that pretty soft introduction. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. And I think I'm up to, 130 or so people watching live. So you can let me know live or as a recorded show what you think about that introduction from Chris Wallace. I thought it was pretty soft and a pretty blatant attempt to humanize Jeb Bush as a compassionate conservative or whatever. Like, I can't believe it would have been any different if it had actually been directed by a member of Jeb Bush's campaign. And for all I know, well, who knows? But anyway, I want to move on to a softball question next that Chris Wallace asked Jeb Bush about Donald Trump. That's why there's a slight little Donald Trump clip at the beginning of this next clip I'm going to show you. There's a little Donald Trump segment. And first, Chris Wallace makes an allusion to Saturday Night Live back in the 80s when Michael Dukakis was running against George H.W. Bush, and which Chris Wallace doesn't get into the reference, but he uses the phrase, "I can't believe I'm losing to this guy," which was like the joke that John Lovitz as Michael Dukakis made in the mock parody presidential debates way back then. And so Chris Wallace says that when he was the moderator of the first Republican debate on Fox News, he looked over at Jeb Bush and thought he was shaking his head thinking, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy. But then you can see it's a pretty much of a softball question as to whether Trump is making him a better candidate over in this clip.
But we need Jeb to build a wall.
I was sitting right across from you in the Fox debate, and as Donald Trump was talking, I could see you sometimes shaking your head like, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy. But recently, starting with the second debate, you've become more assertive, more aggressive, and my question is, do you think in some way Trump is making you a better candidate because he's making you fight harder?
Campaigns are about getting better each and every day. Whether it's Donald Trump or you or anybody else, candidates have to get better, and that's what I intend to do. But I'm running a hard campaign, running with heart, and we're making great progress. These polls really don't matter. They don't filter out the people that aren't going to vote. It's just, I know it's an obsession because it kind of frames the debate for people for that week, but I'm in it for the long haul.
You've also evolved.
So, yeah, like I said, that is a fairly softball question from Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, and, Jeb Bush's answer wasn't really all that impressive, even with that softball. And then the last question I want to show that Chris Wallace asked Jeb Bush in that interview this morning was the one that was a little more confrontational. It's basically Chris Wallace pointing out that Jeb Bush's tax plan is the same as George W. Bush's and Ronald Reagan's even. It's kind of interesting to see Ronald Reagan questioned on Fox News by Chris Wallace. And the fact that Jeb Bush says that the big deficits that even conservative groups say that his tax cuts for the rich are going to cause won't actually happen because of dynamic scoring, which means the economic growth that comes from tax cuts. And Chris Wallace, is fairly confrontational with him about how both for George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, those claims about how dynamic scoring was going to, it's basically trickle-down economics is going to cause growth that overcomes the deficits, never really worked out. And I don't think Jeb Bush's answer is all that impressive again, but you can let me know what you think after you watch that clip here.
There are two major criticisms of your tax plan so far. First of all, the argument that, and you gave your tax plan to 4 conservative economists who said that it would increase the deficit between $1 and $3 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, Ronald Reagan proposed something roughly similar, big tax cuts back in 1980, and he argued that the dynamic effect, the word you used, would be that the growth would end up paying for the revenue loss. You know what your dad called that. Is this your version of voodoo economics?
No, look, the dynamic effect of tax policy that creates economic growth narrows the deficit that you're describing. But first of all, it's not the government's money. It's people's money, and if we can allow people to have more money, clearly that's going to create economic growth. But we're also going to have to fix the regulatory mess in Washington, D.C., embrace the energy revolution in our midst, and have a commitment to reduce the growth of spending, which ultimately means we have to preserve and protect entitlements for those that have it, but fix it going over the long haul.
But whether it was Ronald Reagan's tax cuts or your brother's tax cuts, they did add greatly to the deficit.
They didn't add as greatly as the static thinkers on the left think. They created a dynamic effect of high growth. And that's what we need. If we think that if people think 2% growth is okay, then we'll have more people living in poverty, and disposable income for the middle class will continue to decline. We have to jumpstart the economy so that people can have more money to make decisions for themselves.
Then
I don't know about you, but Jeb Bush there seems pretty much blind to the facts. And I mean, how many times do we have to try trickle-down economics and tax cuts for the rich, and before we realize that it just causes these big deficits, and it doesn't even cause the growth? See, he's saying, well, it caused growth, but I happen to remember his brother's presidency, George W. Bush's presidency, began shortly after he got into office. There was a recession. And as he left office, there was a huge recession. I think if you look at the growth rates averaged for his presidency, they don't look very good. So I don't know what growth he's talking about. It's kind of a ridiculous argument, but that's what passes for Republican tax plan these days, and that's even the most moderate ones have tax cuts for the rich that explode the deficit, and so it's kind of ridiculous. Donald Trump is going to have his tax plan coming out tomorrow, and supposedly there's going to be big taxes on those hedge fund guys. They're not going to like it, but I guess we'll see if that makes news for Donald Trump and brings him up in the polls, because he's not doing so well in the polls. And I'm going to show you a couple of polls now. First, kind of a bogus poll from Fox News, their Fox News Opinion Dynamics poll. It doesn't show like who's ahead and who's behind. It shows their favorability versus unfavorability. Of course, starting with Hillary Clinton to show that she isn't doing really well in her favorability with all voters. And then it shows Ben Carson's favorability, which is only like 8 points higher in the favorable, just much lower in the unfavorable. And so I don't think they really were fair in the way they put those together. And then they pull this switcheroo where they look at the Republican candidates and their favorability with the Republican voters, and they do better there than Hillary did with all voters, of course. And the whole thing is kind of bogus, because I think it's like a measure of how well are the smears working, especially on Hillary Clinton, since Fox News has spent so much time trying to bring down her numbers. This is like, how well is Fox News doing smearing Hillary Clinton at the beginning, and then those other problems I talked about over in this clip.
Hillary Clinton is the big loser, and Dr. Ben Carson is the big winner in the latest Fox News poll. The Democratic frontrunner's favorable rating hits a new low of 38% in a national survey of voters in both parties. That's down 7 points from May. Some 56% of voters now say they have an unfavorable opinion of Clinton. Meanwhile, Dr. Carson now has the best net favorable rating among all voters. Some 46% say they have a positive view of Carson. That's up 20 points since May. And when it comes to Republican voters, Carson is way ahead of the pack. He has a net positive rating, favorable over unfavorable, of plus 52. Marco Rubio is plus 35, Donald Trump is plus 12, and Jeb Bush is plus 1, meaning as many Republicans view him positively as negatively. With that, time to...
And then they go to the panel to talk about those numbers and other things, and I'm not giving you any clips from the panel, and I'm not even sure how useful those favorability versus unfavorabilities are, especially so early in the campaign where the candidates haven't had a lot of time to make their case to the voters. And anyway, I want to show you a more important poll, although even this poll isn't that important this early, but it does show that Dr. Ben Carson is basically tied as the front runner in the Republican field, tied with Donald Trump, and also shows some significant gains for Carly Fiorina, tied with Senator Marco Rubio. This is the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, so I want to show the clip about it from NBC. This is NBC's Meet the Press, Chuck Todd talking about that latest poll in this clip.
New NBC News Wall Street Journal poll now to where the Republican race stands this morning, and yes, things are getting tighter on that side of the aisle. Donald Trump and Ben Carson are essentially tied at the top. Trump at 21, Carson at 20. Then two more in double digits are Marco Rubio and Carly Fiorina, tied at third with 11%. They're followed in high single digits by Jeb Bush, John Kasich, and Ted Cruz. No one else. If you don't see your candidate there, it means they didn't even top 3%. And when you compare these numbers, by the way, to where we were in July, you can see that Carson, Rubio, and Kasich all have doubled their support. On the other hand, Bush and Cruz saw their support cut in half. And by the way, there's a name you don't see on the board at all. It was Scott Walker in July. Walker was in second place alone at 15%. And of course, he dropped out of the race less than a week ago. Another big change is for Carly Fiorina. She literally came from nothing. She was at 0 to where she is today, tied for third. And Carly Fiorina joins me right after the break.
And I am going to show you Carly Fiorina next, because she is one of the big winners in this new poll. She's tied for second, or I guess it's technically tied for third with Marco Rubio, since Dr. Ben Carson and Donald Trump are both tied for first. That means the next two people tied would be tied for third. And Carly Fiorina was over on Meet the Press, and remember last week I showed the way that Chuck Todd had fact-checked Carly Fiorina on her debate statement about Planned Parenthood and the terrible right-wing videos that have been edited to they put in like some stock footage trying to show these stillborn babies to claim that Planned Parenthood was letting aborted fetuses die to harvest their brains, and Carly Fiorina made a this impassioned but dishonest statement about that in the last Republican debate. Anyway, here's Chuck Todd spending about 3.5 minutes trying to get her to own up to the fact that she was exaggerating, being dishonest, whatever you want to say. What she said is not actually there's no evidence that what she talked about is something Planned Parenthood did, as I'll discuss after you watch that 3.5 minute clip from Meet the Press this morning here.
Performance in the 2 Republican debates that Carly Fiorina has participated in. Her rise in our new poll should not be a surprise, and she joins me now after campaigning in Iowa this weekend. She's been in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Carly Fiorina, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good morning, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
You got it. Let me start right in with the Planned Parenthood situation. At the debate, the most recent debate, you described the following scene, claiming it was on a tape. A fully formed fetus on the table, its heart beating, its legs kicking, while someone says we have to keep it alive to harvest its brain. Since then, when asked about the claim, your campaign has attacked Planned Parenthood, but there is no tapes. There is no evidence that the scene you described exists. Are you willing now to concede that you exaggerated that scene?
No, not at all. That scene absolutely does exist, and that voice saying what I said they were saying, we're going to keep it alive to harvest its brain, exists as well. Here's the thing. Yesterday,
so you saw that
I was
moment
at
on the
a
tape
football game.
You saw that moment on the tape.
Yes, and I would challenge Planned Parenthood. Here's the deal. Yesterday, I was protested by Planned Parenthood people who were throwing condoms at me. I don't know what that has to do with this. They're trying to distract the American people from the hideous reality that Planned Parenthood is aborting fetuses alive to harvest their brains and other body parts. That is a fact. Planned Parenthood will not and cannot deny this because it is happening. It is happening in this nation, and taxpayers are paying for it. Planned Parenthood desperately wants everyone to think this isn't going on, because when Americans realize it is going on, whether they are pro-life or pro-choice, they are horrified. This goes to the character of our nation, and it must be stopped.
Well, the footage you described, at best, is a reenactment. The videos, even the people that made the videos, admit it's stock footage. Yet you went right along and said it's Planned Parenthood.
Chuck, do you think this is not happening? Does Hillary Clinton think this is not happening? So sad that you missed the opportunity to ask Mrs. Clinton why she said late-term abortions were only performed for medical purposes. That is patently false. This is happening in America today, and taxpayers are paying for it. That is a fact. It is a reality, and no one can run away from it.
But you are sort of ducking the video, the specific of this question. And I guess I'm trying, because let me tell you what a Washington Post... A Washington Post editorial this morning. A Washington Post editorial is calling it a full-fledged falsehood, Ms. Fiorina. They said,
okay, well,
why don't you? They said that it doesn't excuse your mistruths. They said they understand you have a deeply held belief on abortion, but that you're exaggerating this specific claim.
Well, first of all, the Washington Post also claims that I am lying about being a secretary. So let's get real. I mean, I don't even know how to deal with that. I was a secretary, part-time to put myself through college and full-time after I graduated. The Washington Post gave me 3 Pinocchios for claiming that I was a secretary. So honestly, I don't think the Washington Post has a lot of credibility here. This is not about being pro-life or pro-choice. It is certainly not about birth control. It is not even about women's health. It is about the character of our nation. No one can deny this is happening because it is happening.
Do you believe?
So that's just awful. That's shows that American politics has come to the point where someone can just say something dishonest. I mean, exaggeration is a mild term for what Carly Fiorina was doing there. And I think it's the Trumpization of our politics. That's what Carly Fiorina has learned from Donald Trump. She's like a softer version of Donald Trump, or trying to make herself into a softer version of Donald Trump, maybe. Maybe that's why Donald Trump was attacking her face, because he was afraid she'd be a slightly more attractive version of the Donald Trump character that he's portraying in the Republican race. But what the Trumpization of our politics means is you say something that's not true, and when people point out that you're being dishonest, that you're misstating the facts, you deny it, you attack them, you attack the messenger, you deflect to attack the Democrats, of course. That's what Carly Fiorina does. And you just double down, triple down, deny, and just keep going. There's like never a point where there's accountability for saying something that's totally untrue. And by the way, I looked up the Washington Post article questioning whether she was a secretary, and they even said in that article that she worked part-time as a secretary. They were actually gave her 3 Pinocchios for her, like, Horatio Alger rags to riches story about going from secretary to CEO, when in fact she came from a fairly privileged family. Her father was a judge, conservative judge who actually helped appoint Ken Starr to investigate the Clintons, from what I was reading in that Washington Post article. And anyway, so I wanted to show one clip of Carly Fiorina and following up on that Planned Parenthood thing, because that's just awful, that whole Planned Parenthood falsehood that both she is spreading, and now it looks like it may even shut down the government, though I'm not going to show any clips on that, but that's kind of what John Boehner's resignation was all about. What I do want to move on to is the new front runner in the Republican field, or at least tied for front runner with Donald Trump. Dr. Ben Carson was on a couple shows over on This Week with George Stephanopoulos talking to Martha Raddatz. In the first clip I want to show, you can see Martha Raddatz asks him about his comments about Muslims and does a little bit of follow-up to make it pretty evident that he is overgeneralizing about and sort of assuming that Muslims believe in like a fundamentalist Sharia version of Islam, and that he somehow thinks there's like an official doctrine that all Muslims believe in, and doesn't. It's almost what you see from Bill Maher sometimes. But anyway, here's Ben Carson's version talking to Martha Raddatz. This is not the interview that a member of his campaign abruptly ends. That's going to be over on CNN's Jake Tapper with a similar question. But here's Martha Raddatz's version on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning, where Martha Raddatz guest hosted in this clip.
I want to go back to your controversial comments on the possibility of a Muslim president. The question seemed quite clear. The question was, should a president's faith matter? You said, I guess it depends on what that faith is. The question was, so do you believe that Islam is consistent with the Constitution? And you said, no, I do not. I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that. Do you stand by that now?
Well, first of all, what I said is on a transcript, and it's there for anybody to see.
I'm reading the transcript, Dr. Carson. That's exactly what you said.
No, read the paragraph before that, where I said anybody, it doesn't matter what their religious background, if they accept American values and principles and are willing to subjugate their religious beliefs to our Constitution, I have no problem with them. Why do you guys always leave that part out, I wonder?
I don't think we do, Dr. Carson, and it really was quite clear. I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. You also talked about Sharia law, that they must denounce Sharia law. Do you assume that all Muslims embrace Sharia law?
Well, what we should be talking about is Islam and the tenets of Islam, and where do they come from? They come from Sharia. They come from the Quran. They come from, the life works and examples of Muhammad. They come from the fatwas, which is the writings of the scholars. And if you go back and you look at what I would like for somebody to show me is an approved Islamic text that opposes Sharia. Let me see, if you can show me that, I will begin to alter my thinking on this. But right now, when you have something that is against the rights of women, against the rights of gays, subjugates other religions, and a host of things that are not compatible with our Constitution, why, in fact, would you take that chance? That's one of the reasons.
Dr. Carson, I want to get through several topics here if we can. Excuse me for interrupting, but I want.
So I actually purposely left in that little clip of Martha Raddatz at the end where she interrupts him. He's getting close to the 2.5-minute mark, And I guess Martha Raddatz in that clip thinks she's gone far enough to show her viewers that Dr. Ben Carson has a kind of warped view of Islam, where he thinks there's some like authority that approves rejection of Sharia, and it's not like a whole bunch of different sects and a whole bunch of, you know, different people who have their own interpretations. Of course, there are radical Muslims and fundamentalist Muslims, just like there are in other groups, and maybe it's worse in Islam. Or in terms of the percentage than in any other religion, possibly. I don't know if there are any numbers that would prove that, but my point has always been that that there are reasonable people who look at the same text and come to a different interpretation than those fundamentalist radical Muslims. And I happen to know and sometimes even work with a lot of liberal Muslims in the United States, and they don't take from their religion the tenets that Dr. Ben Carson or sometimes Bill Maher talks about. And the fact that people, as I've said many times, I think people bring their own cultural and even personal biases when they come to religion. And, you know, people take out of the religious texts and their religion, in a lot of cases, what they bring into it to begin with. And I don't think religion makes good people bad or bad people good. I think that bad people take bad things out of religion and good people take good things out of religion. And there may be a lot more violence in some of the areas of the world where more people are Muslim, and that's kind of reflected in the fact that there are these civil wars. And anyway, I'm going way off on a tangent, but now I want to show how a different reporter, Jake Tapper, or different anchor, Jake Tapper on CNN State of the Union, unlike Martha Raddatz, he does not interrupt Dr. Ben Carson. He keeps going after him, not only wanting to show the audience that Ben Carson has these sort of prejudiced views of Muslims, but he actually keeps after him, trying to get him to admit that he's being prejudiced. And of course that doesn't work, and this goes on for almost 6 minutes. And if you listen carefully at the end, off camera, you'll hear a voice that is from someone in the Carson campaign, I assume, saying the interview is over, and that's the end of the CNN State of the Union interview of Dr. Ben Carson by anchor Jake Tapper in this clip.
You said last week, quote, "I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that."
I would advocate that people go back and look at the transcript.
Should a president's faith matter? Should your faith matter to voters?
Well, I guess it depends on what that faith is. If it's inconsistent with the values and principles of America, then of course it should matter. But if it fits within the realm of America and consistent with the Constitution, no problem.
So do you believe that Islam is consistent with the Constitution?
No, I don't. I do not. I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that.
He'd asked you about Islam, if you thought Islam was conducive to the Constitution, and you said Muslims, that you would have a problem with a Muslim being president.
I would have problems with somebody who embraced all the doctrines associated with Islam. If they're not willing to reject, Sharia and all the portions of it that are talked about in the Quran. If they're not willing to reject that and subject that to American values and the Constitution, then of course I wouldn't. And I would ask you, would you be willing to do that? Would you be willing to advocate for somebody who would not do that? Probably not.
I don't assume that because somebody's Muslim that they would put their religion ahead of the U.S. Constitution. And in fact, the U.S. Constitution itself says no religious test.
Yeah, except that I had already said before that anybody from any religion, from any background, if they are, I told you what the criteria were for that. I told Chuck Todd what the criteria were. So he's asking this out of that context.
You don't think that in any way you said anything that could have been said more clearly about Muslims?
I made it very clear.
Because you seem to be singling out Muslims as individuals who automatically, as a knee-jerk, would put their religion ahead of the country, and I think that offended a lot of people, including a lot of patriotic Muslims.
I think the statement stands, is it possible that maybe the media thinks that it's a bigger deal than the American people do?
I think
because the American people, the majority of them, agree with, and they understand exactly what I'm saying.
I think I've heard from a lot of people who don't think that Muslims can be patriotic who agree with you. And I don't know that if I were running for president, I would want the support of people like that.
Of course Muslims can be patriotic. I've worked with Muslims, I've trained Muslims, I've operated on Muslims. I have a lot of Muslims who are very patriotic, good Americans, and they gladly admit, at least privately, that they don't accept Sharia or the doctrines, and they understand that Islam is a system of living, and it includes the way that you relate to the government. And you cannot, unless you specifically deny that portion of Islam, be a Muslim in good standing. Now, if that is the case, if you're not willing to reject that, then how in the world can you possibly be the president of the United States?
So you are saying that there is something specific about being a Muslim, that you have to reject Islam in order to be a president. That's
well, you have to reject the tenets of Islam. Yes, you have to.
And that's different from an Orthodox Jew or a devout Christian?
If there's a devout Christian who's running and they refuse to reject the ideals of our Constitution, or if they want to establish a theocracy, I cannot advocate for them.
I guess the point is, you seem to be suggesting that Muslim Americans automatically want a theocracy, and I just don't know any Muslim Americans, and I know plenty who feel that way, even if they are observant Muslims.
Okay, in terms of the tenets of Islam, are you familiar with them?
I'm familiar.
The corpus juris from the authoritative group of the people who make the rules that goes back to the 10th century AD.
I'm familiar with extremist interpretations of plenty of religions.
I'm not talking about extremist interpretations. I'm talking about what is required. And you have to make a specific declaration and decision to reject the portions of it.
What portions of it?
The portions of it that tell you how you treat women, the portions of it that indicate that the kafir, who are the people who are not believers, are subject to different rules, that they can be dominated.
I think one of the things is just, you are a member of a church that there's a lot of misinformation about, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. You're an African American. You know what it's like for people to make false assumptions about you. And you seem to be doing the same thing with Muslims.
In which way am I making a false assumption about
You're
them?
assuming that Muslim Americans put their religion ahead of the country.
I'm assuming that if you accept all the tenets of Islam, that you will have a very difficult time abiding under the Constitution of the United States.
Okay.
This interview is over.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Appreciate it.
Sorry, I had to turn the volume up a little to try to help you hear at the end there that someone from the Carson campaign said this interview is over. Presumably someone from the Carson campaign, and that's what ended that interview after about 6 minutes of trying to get not only what Martha Raddatz showed, that Ben Carson was basically being prejudiced towards Muslims, but then Jake Tapper spent like an additional 3 minutes trying to get Dr. Ben Carson, the tied frontrunner of the Republican field, to admit that he was being prejudiced against Muslims. Of course, based on some of the comments I get from my viewers when I have taken on Bill Maher for saying some of these same things, I know that there are a lot of people out there who agree with Dr. Ben Carson, even amongst my viewers. And especially, I think, in the Republican field, I don't think this is going to hurt Dr. Ben Carson at all as a possible Republican nominee. I mean, he is one of the front runners now. Who knows what's going to happen in this weird year of the outsider, or I guess election cycle of the outsider, since the actual election is next year. But before I leave Dr. Ben Carson, I want to point out that since Martha Raddatz did not have Dr. Ben Carson abruptly end the interview, or at least a member of his campaign end the interview after going too far on the whole Muslim question, Martha Raddatz was able to ask a different question that in some ways may be a more a topic of interest to people than whether a Muslim can be president. And it is this strange relationship that has developed between Dr. Ben Carson and Kanye West. Apparently, Kanye West has taken a liking to Dr. Ben Carson after seeing him speak and thinking he was brilliant. And so Martha Raddatz followed up with that and found out that they've actually had they've had communication, they've connected, and here's what they talked about and what Dr. Ben Carson thinks about Kanye West over in this clip.
Others.
And just one final question. Kanye West told an interviewer earlier this month that when he heard you speak, he thought you were the most brilliant guy, and he tried to call you. First of all, I want to know whether you got in touch in the last few weeks and what you think of him, whether you'd like him to help out with your campaign.
Well, I did have an opportunity to talk with him. I was extremely impressed with his business acumen. He knows a lot about business. And, I talked to him about the possibility of maybe himself and some of the other people in the pop culture doing some music that might be uplifting, that might give young women a sense of their value and young men a sense of responsibility. I think it could be a tremendous thing in our society.
Do you think you'd be a good president someday? 2020?
Well, I'm certainly willing to give him a chance. We'll see. He'll be able to explain things and see if he resonates with the people.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Dr.
So I guess that's what Martha Raddatz gets for not going on for that extra 3 minutes on the issue of whether Dr. Ben Carson thinks a Muslim can be president. She got to ask about his contact with Kanye West and how he's maybe going to work with Kanye on uplifting messages about women, and he might even consider him as a possible 2020 presidential candidate. I guess that's if Ben Carson isn't elected president in this cycle. Who knows? But that's the last clip I want to show on the Republican side. I now have, I think, 7 clips. So on the Democratic side, the first thing I want to show is another poll. This is the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that shows that Bernie Sanders has pulled within 7 points of Hillary Clinton in a national poll. But for the conspiracy theorists out there, and conspiracy theories are going to come up a couple times in Chuck Todd's interview of Hillary Clinton, but you'll watch this next clip where Chuck Todd talks about the poll results, and he makes it look like Bernie Sanders is within 7 points of Hillary Clinton in Iowa, or the graphic does. I think it's actually a mistake in putting the graphic together, because Chuck Todd never says the word Iowa, but the first poll numbers they flash up on the screen, the word Iowa is up there where it shouldn't be, because I actually looked this up afterwards because I got confused, and this is nationally, not just Iowa voters, where Bernie Sanders is within 7 points of Hillary Clinton. And then they switch over to this other number with Biden not in the race, and I'll talk about that a little more after you see this poll result, which is Bernie Sanders within 7 points of Hillary Clinton. That is actually pretty good news for the FeelTheBern Bernie Sanders fans out there over in this clip.
So let's start with our new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. Among Democrats, Hillary Clinton's lead over Bernie Sanders is now down to just 7 points, 42 to 35. That includes Joe Biden in the race at 17. If you take Biden out of the mix, Mrs. Clinton's lead stretches to 15 points, 53-38. So you see there, Biden takes a lot more from Secretary Clinton than Sanders. But look at this. Back in June, Clinton's lead over Sanders was 60 points, 6-0, 75 to 15. Quite a dramatic change in just 3 months. We'll have
So it wasn't entirely negative in terms of Bernie Sanders. That was sort of a positive spin or positive towards Bernie Sanders at the end. But it was kind of weird that they left the word Iowa in the beginning of the clip there where it didn't belong, because that was not an Iowa poll. That was a national poll where Bernie Sanders is within 7% of Hillary Clinton. That's the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that just came out. So I want to move on to some actual clips of Hillary Clinton, who did another Sunday morning news analysis show interview where she can get questioned over and over again. You know, I showed you the 6-minute follow-up after follow-up that Jake Tapper did on CNN of Dr. Ben Carson. Well, Hillary Clinton came on NBC's Meet the Press, and I think Chuck Todd did a pretty good job of going over and over and over the territory of her emails, and I'm not going to show the entire thing on the emails, but I'm going to show how he began the interview with Hillary Clinton, where he brought up conspiracy theories, where he said, just for those with the conspiracy theories, there have been no limits placed on this interview. That, which is kind of a weird way to start an interview, and Hillary Clinton agrees to that. Like, if there were a conspiracy, I think that's proof of the conspiracy, because if there weren't a conspiracy, they wouldn't have worked that out to throw us off the scent, right? Because any evidence against the conspiracy is evidence of the cover-up. Always remember that. Any evidence that negates the conspiracy is just evidence of the cover-up. And you can see that at the beginning of this clip that was actually about the emails, where Chuck Todd showed an old clip of Hillary Clinton saying that she believes in transparency, and she didn't really show it in this case, or, well, you'll see it after you, and I'll talk about it after you watch that clip here.
Reminder, and I know there's all conspiracy theories out there. There are no limitations to this to this interview. You know,
as far as I know,
exactly,
that's true.
exactly.
Absolutely.
So let's get that out of the way. Let me start with a piece of sound. It's Meet the Press. This is what you said on Meet the Press 7 years ago about transparency.
I want to have a much more transparent government, and I think we now have the tools to make that happen. I want to have as much information about the way our government operates on the internet, so the people who pay for it, the taxpayers of America, can see that.
A year later, ClintonEmail.com, this server started, private server. Had every government agency head did what you did at the State Department, there would be a lot of information that wasn't in the public. Do you see that now as a problem as far as the public is concerned?
Well, Chuck, let me make a couple of points. First of all, as I have said very often, all of the emails that I sent were intended to be in the government systems if they were work-related. That's why I sent them to people at their work addresses. And, you know, the vast majority of them ended up there. So I have said also that if I had to do it all over again, I would have used a separate email account. I did it for convenience, and it turned out not to be that at all. But the bottom line is, my emails were predominantly in the State Department system or on other government servers, and then I said I'm going to give them all after a very careful review, and I did so.
All right.
Now, I've said many times in previous broadcasts that I think this is a scandal, pretty much, and the whole thing about her going to jail, or there being a cover-up of something in the emails. I haven't seen the evidence of that yet, although I suppose further evidence could develop. But the one concern I've always had is the concern that Chuck Todd raised there, and he's going to raise in another question, not the next one, but the question after next. Basically, I've worked as an ACLU activist over the years on several issues that involve getting public records from the government, where it's really important when you make one of those Freedom of Information Act requests that the government isn't hiding the information on some private server, that it's available. And what Hillary Clinton said there about how, well, most of the emails I sent went to people who had government addresses, well, that doesn't really stop the problem. And Chuck Todd will bring that up, like I said, in the next, not the next question, but the question after next. The next question is actually about the breaking news that some earlier emails, or some emails from the Clinton server, were found that came from earlier than she said she first started using it. But we're talking about like March 2009 versus January 2009. Remember, Barack Obama took office in January 2009. You win in 2008 and then you take office in January 2009. So it's actually kind of nitpicky, I think. It's another like non-scandal part. But I will show you that whole exchange, and it kind of exhausts Hillary Clinton's talking points pretty much on the email scandal itself, I think, here, or scandal.
A couple of things there, but let me start with just the news of this week. You had said in a written statement under oath that you had turned over everything that you believed you had for the federal records with those 55,000 emails, but we've now discovered an email chain between then General Petraeus and yourself that took place a couple of months before these records started. Can you explain the discrepancy there? Because it was the same email address that you used while at State that you were using with General Petraeus just 2 months before you had said everything was out there.
Well, everything that we had access to was certainly out there, and the reason we know about the email chain with General Petraeus is because it was on a government server. And so from my perspective, we have a very thorough review process that we conducted. And my attorneys supervised it. They went through everything, and what we had available at the time was turned over.
But I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, if you'd said in March that that the email system began in March of '09, and yet we have the same email address popping up in January, explain that discrepancy?
There was a transition period. You know, I wasn't that focused on my email account, to be clear
let me
here.
stop you there, because you say you weren't focused on it,
Right.
except this seemed to be, to put an email server at your house is not it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, but it was already there. It had been there for years. It is the system that my husband's personal office used when he got out of the White House. And so it was sitting there in the basement. It was not any trouble at all. I know there are a lot of people who are, you know, questioning that, but the fact is that it was there. I added my account to it. It apparently took a little time to do that. And so there was about a month where I didn't have everything already on the server. And we went back, tried to, you know, recover whatever we could recover. And I think it's also fair to say that, you know, there's some things about this that I just can't control. I can't control the technical aspects of it. I'm not by any means a technical expert. I relied on people who were, and we have done everything we could in response to the State Department asking us to do this review, because they asked all the former secretaries. And the reason they asked, Chuck, is because they found gaps in their own record keeping. Right. You know, my assumption, because this system was there before I became secretary, it was there when I left, my assumption was anything that I sent to a .gov account would be captured.
But you know, that's very difficult to capture all of your emails by going to perhaps thousands of people in their .gov accounts. It would have been a lot easier if it was sent to your .gov account.
Well, but when you communicate with people in other parts of the government, you're not sending it to the State Department.gov, and that would have been true either way. Look, I think I have done all that I can to, you know, take responsibility, to be as transparent as possible in turning over 55,000 pages, in turning over my server, and to, you know, testify on October 22nd, which I've been asking to do before the Congress.
Oh, excuse me. Oh, I saw it down in the comment section. Some people were saying this is the most boring scandal ever, and yeah, listening to some of the details is kind of boring. That was my little joke there, but I think that what Hillary Clinton's justifications there, I mean, when it comes to how she set up the server and whether the email was like from January or March and how they split up the emails, that's the part where I start falling asleep and I'm really bored. The only part that really interests me is that part that Chuck Todd was asking about at the end, that if you make a request or you're Congress trying to get oversight, it's a lot harder to find the emails if you have to find, you know, ask all the people who Hillary Clinton sent emails to instead of just getting them all from the sender. You know, it's a lot harder to track down all the recipients than to just get it all from the sender, which is, and I didn't think Hillary Clinton really answered that. And this is another about, I think, 90 seconds, a little under 90 seconds from Chuck Todd, talking specifically again about Freedom of Information Act requests and congressional oversight, which, like I said, I think are the two things that have any significance in this fairly non-scandal scandal. But you tell me what you think after you watch that clip here.
Can you respond to an alternative explanation that has sort of
another conspiracy theory?
Let me that perhaps the reason you wanted to have a private server and not a government server is that Republicans have been coming after you for years. You may have been running for president in the future, and you wanted to make it a little more difficult for congressional investigators to subpoena your government emails and a little more difficult for Freedom of Information Act requests. Is that a fair theory or no?
It's totally ridiculous. That never crossed my mind. And in fact, since more than 90% of my work-related emails were on the system, they are subject to FOIA or any other request. That's how the Benghazi committee got the emails even before we, went through our exhaustive process. Now, I have, as you're rightly pointing out, been involved from the receiving side in a lot of these accusations. In fact, as you might remember, during the 90s, there were a bunch of them. And, all of them turned out to be not true. That was the outcome. And when I ran for the Senate, the voters of New York, they overlooked all of that, and they looked at my record, and they looked at what I would do for them, and I was elected senator after going through years of this kind of back and forth. And it is, it's regrettable, but it's part of the system.
One of the things...
There was a little slip in there from Hillary Clinton where she said the voters of New York overlooked all of that. I think she meant looked over all of that and decided there was nothing there, not overlooked it. That has kind of a slightly different meaning, but whatever, just a slight little slip. I actually noticed, I earlier noticed that Dr. Ben Carson, when he was talking to, in one of those answers, I think it was talking to Jake Tapper when he was talking about, how devout Christians, would he have a problem with the devout Christian who, put his religion over the Constitution? He said, well, it's okay if a devout Christian refuses to reject the ideals of our Constitution. But anyway, should have said that after I showed that clip. But now I'm going to show one last clip of Hillary Clinton. It's not really about policy, but it isn't about emails, thank God. Or that's just a figure of speech, excuse me. But this is Hillary Clinton talking about how she's moved to the left, and you'll see Chuck Todd actually compares her to Bernie Sanders, and the next couple clips after this are going to be actual Bernie Sanders clips. But this is Hillary Clinton explaining why she's moved to the left so much, with Chuck Todd confronting her with several flip-flops, basically, or flips to the left. And like I said, in part of this back and forth, Chuck Todd compares her to Bernie Sanders, who was on the left on these issues much earlier than Hillary Clinton, which I'll talk about after you see that over here.
Play a little comp we put together of some of the positions where your positions have changed a little bit. Take a look.
So it is with conviction that I support this resolution as being in the best interests of our nation.
I've made it very clear that I made a mistake, plain and simple.
I believe that marriage is not just a bond, but a sacred bond between a man and a woman.
This morning, love triumphed in the highest court in our land. We've not yet signed off on it, but we are inclined to do so. We're either going to be dependent on dirty oil from the Gulf or dependent on dirty oil from Canada.
I oppose it, and I oppose it because I don't think it's in the best interests of what we need to do to combat climate change.
So how do you respond to some critics who say, your positions have changed out of political expediency, that you're sort of, whatever the majority is at that time, that's the position you have?
Well, I just don't think that reflects either my assessment of issues, and I don't think it reflects how people who are thoughtful actually conduct their lives. I mean, if we don't learn, if we don't, make decisions based on the best information we have available, well, that's regrettable. And what I've always tried to do is to say, okay, what is the best decision that I can think about making? Now, with those that you did, number one on the Iraq war vote, I've written about it, I've talked about it, I said it was a mistake. It certainly became a very clear mistake when you saw the way the Bush administration conducted that war and the decisions that they made. And so I have been very forthright in saying, as I looked at what was happening, it was a mistake. On same-sex marriage, like a lot of people, including our president, I did evolve. And I was not raised to even imagine this, and I'm thrilled now that it is the law of the land. And I have a lot of good friends who are now able to be married because of the changes we've made legally and constitutionally. When it comes to Keystone, you know, I was at the beginning of the process of trying to evaluate what was the best outcome. I did feel that I shouldn't jump in before the president and Secretary Kerry and make my views known, because they're still in the middle of that process. But it was, frankly, uncomfortable to have so many people asking me, and my saying, you know, I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, and it still hasn't happened. I don't know when it will happen. It may have to happen when I'm president, I hope. So I said, look, I'm against it. On the total evaluation,
Right.
when I made that statement years ago, we did not have the kind of energy profile that we now have. We did not have the full understanding of how the particular oil that would have been extracted from those tar sands was of a different degree of dirtiness and polluting in terms of greenhouse gases. So, you know, I'm not going to sit here and tell people that I make up my mind. That's the Republicans. They make up their mind. They're never bothered by evidence.
But Bernie Sanders has been on the sort of where you are on these issues. Bernie Sanders was there when it came to marriage 20 years ago. When it came, do you think one of the reasons he's doing well right now is some progressives think, well, you know what, he was there when it wasn't popular?
Well, he can speak for himself, and I certainly respect his views. I can just tell you that I am not someone who, you know, stakes out a position and holds it regardless of the evidence or regardless of the way that I perceive what's happening in the world around me. And as I was saying, that's where the Republicans are. You know, they're still believing in trickle-down economics, even though it was a disaster not once but twice for our country. So I want people, because I think my experience on these issues is much more reflective of how people talk to me about how they too have evolved and moved in their understanding, and I feel, you know, very comfortable saying that.
Well, I have a lot more questions, and the good news is I have a part 2 interview we're going to do for the new show, my new show, MTP Daily. So we will get into some foreign policy, domestic policy, a whole bunch of stuff. Madam Secretary, thanks for.
So you heard at the end there why there was no talk of domestic and foreign policy in Chuck Todd's Meet the Press interview, because he's starting a new show on MSNBC where he's going to do Meet the Press every day. It's MTP Daily. That's what, I don't know if is there enough Meet the Press material for every day? Maybe there is. I mean, I think Chuck Todd has done a fairly good job. I mean, I've talked about some of his failures, but week after week, I think he's done. Most weeks, I think he's done a better job than the other 4 corporate, the corporate media shows from Sunday morning that I cover. So I'll be interested to see how Chuck Todd does on a daily basis on MSNBC. And the other thing I noticed about that answer from Hillary Clinton about how she's moved to the left, I mean, some of it makes sense that you have to change your opinion when you get new facts, but a lot of it was talking points. She had talking points on all the issues, on, you know, Iraq and Keystone and marriage equality. But I noticed when Chuck Todd asked her about, you know, Bernie Sanders was there on marriage equality 20 years before you were, she went right into this talking point about how, well, Bernie can speak to his views, which is kind of a non sequitur as part of that answer, about, because if you look carefully about what Chuck Todd asked, it was, you know, is that why he's doing better because he was 20 years ahead of you? I don't know how well Bernie can speak to his views. Is really, it's more an answer to the question about like negative campaigning and you know, whether they have a clash of views if someone had brought that up, which isn't really what Chuck Todd brought up. But now I want to move to my last 2 clips on the Democratic side. Last but not least, Senator Bernie Sanders, 2 clips from him. First, on the subject of negative campaigning, this is over on CBS's Face the Nation. John Dickerson brings up what Hillary Clinton told him last week about how she's pledging not to engage in negative attacks, and Bernie Sanders says, well, he never engages in negative attacks. And then I actually picked this clip partly because it seems like John Dickerson and Bernie Sanders both don't understand that super PACs and candidates are not allowed to coordinate. So, like, anything that Hillary Clinton says as a pledge cannot bind her super PAC because she can't tell the super PAC what to do under these laws that aren't enforced, or maybe what they're saying at the end means that the laws are so ridiculous people just don't even mention that they exist anymore, which I'll talk about after you see that first Bernie Sanders clip on CBS's Face the Nation this morning here.
United States of America.
Hillary Clinton, when I spoke to her last week, said she had, quote, no interest in attacking you. You've said you won't attack her. Do you take her at her word?
Well, I certainly do, and I hope that that will be the case. Look, I think one of the reasons our campaign is doing well is we are focusing on the real issues that impact the middle class and working families of this country. The decline of the middle class, income and wealth inequality, climate change, a corrupt campaign finance system, affordability of college, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I do. I happen to have known Hillary Clinton for the last 25 years. I respect her. I admire her. I'm not going to get into the business of attacking her. I've never run a negative political ad in my life. Ask the people of Vermont, and they will tell you a lot of very ugly ads have been run against me. I've never run a negative ad in my life. So I hope that in this campaign we can have a civil discourse discussing our differences of opinion, which are many, on the important issues facing our country. I think that is what the American people want us to do.
What about her super PAC ads? Do you think that her promise extends to those?
Well, I would certainly hope so.
Let me ask you one then.
Now, Senator Bernie Sanders may certainly hope so, but it would actually be illegal in a law that is barely enforced for anything Hillary Clinton said to bind the super PAC that is set up that everybody knows is supporting Hillary Clinton. I can't remember the name of her super PAC. It's probably Hillary for America or something. I don't know. But the thing is, under the campaign finance rules, there can be no coordination between campaigns and super PACs because they're independent expenditures. But the Federal Election Commission never really enforces that rule. And these super PACs are set up with all these very recent advisors and employees of Hillary Clinton and her campaign, or if they're incumbent politicians, it can be like their congressional staff are the head of the super PACs, and it's that, like I said, there actually is coordination, but legally there shouldn't be any way that Hillary Clinton can bind what her super PAC does with some pledge about no negative attacks. But I'm glad that everybody is saying on the Democratic side that they should talk about issues and not negative attacks. And I want to show one more clip from Bernie Sanders on CBS's Face the Nation. This is where John Dickerson actually tries to, it's a confrontational question where John Dickerson is saying to Bernie Sanders that he downplayed his support for being pro-choice and for being pro-marriage equality when he went and talked to these conservative Christians at Liberty University. But I think in the answer you'll see Senator Bernie Sanders actually show how he's going to try to use income inequality to reach out to non-traditional voters, or voters who don't traditionally vote for Democrats, like the people at Liberty University, like evangelical Christians. And I'll talk about that a little more after you watch that clip here.
You did something politicians don't normally do, which is go into an audience that is not there just to applaud you automatically. You went to Liberty University, fundamentalist Christian university, and you brought your same message. One of the things you said was that the audience, you knew you had a disagreement on the question of abortion and on same-sex marriage, but you asked them to put those disagreements aside and focus on the priority, which is the inequities in the economic system. Would you have the same message for liberals that on those issues that really stop the fighting about those and focus on the big thing, which is the economic inequality?
Well, look, this is what I said at Liberty, and this is what I believe. I am pro-choice. I've always been pro-choice. I am strongly in favor of gay marriage, and I know that at Liberty University, people there have honest disagreements with me on that issue. But what I said, look, at a time when we have a grotesque level of income and wealth inequality, when almost all of the new income and wealth in this country is going to the top 1%, when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, when many, many millions of Americans are working 2 or 3 jobs just to sustain themselves, can we not get together and talk about creating an economy that works for all of us and not just millionaires and billionaires. When children go hungry in America, that is a moral issue. When 51% of African American kids are either unemployed or underemployed, that is a moral issue. And I know that at Liberty University, and among the evangelical community, you have some very sincere, honest people who take these issues seriously. And by the way, many of them are concerned, as Pope Francis is, about climate change and the need to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. They believe that the earth created by God cannot be destroyed by greed. And my question was, can we work together to address those issues?
I'd like to play...
So I think that was a fairly good 90-second or so soundbite from Bernie Sanders about how he can reach out to non-traditional voters, voters who don't traditionally vote for Democrats, like speaking at Liberty University, what John Dickerson seemed like he was trying to say, you downplayed your beliefs to go talk to these conservative Christians, but I think Bernie Sanders flipped it around there and made it into a positive. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. So that's the last clip I want to show on the Democratic side, although I noticed Bernie Sanders at the end there, he talked a little bit about the Pope, who is kind of showing how there's a liberal side to Christianity, and that's something I've known for a long time. I talked about earlier how as an ACLU activist, I've worked with a lot of liberal Muslims over the years, also a lot of liberal Christians who were in favor of marriage equality. I know I'm not the Pope, of course, and I actually have gotten a little bit sick of all the Pope coverage, and so I'm not really going to show any real clips of the Pope or news coverage of the Pope, and in fact, instead, I'm going to give you just two clips, and it's kind of anti-Pope coverage. It's the part of what the Pope said that, or what isn't really being said in some of the coverage, I think. But first, I'm going to just show a joke that Bill Maher made about the Pope and his participation in this interfaith ceremony. I think it was at the site of in New York of the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, and I kind of like how Bill Maher makes a general attack on religion, I guess, which I'll explain after you watch that clip here.
Please. And the Pope was in New York today. What a schedule this guy keeps at the age of 78. A lot of poping he did today. Started with an interfaith ceremony at Ground Zero. The Pope was there with a rabbi, an imam, a Hindu, a Buddhist, and a Sikh. And the Pope was very gracious. He said, we may hold different faiths, but we are brought together by the knowledge that we all believe in some form of utter nonsense.
Now, I mean, compared to what Bill Maher says about Muslims and how there's something wrong with the Muslim faith specifically, what he said there about how all religions, all faiths share in common this, belief in some kind of utter nonsense. Now, that actually I don't think is Islamophobic or religiphobic or, anti-theist so much as it's a, comedic take on what is true about faith, that faith is irrational. It's based on believing something for which there's no evidence, and that is a basic problem with all religions. I don't have any problem with Bill Maher pointing that out, and I don't think it's the same thing that he does with Muslims, where kind of what Dr. Ben Carson said is that he's assuming all Muslims believe in these, strict fundamentalist principles that you get from one reading of certain texts, and he doesn't recognize that there are liberal Muslims and moderate Muslims and left center Muslims and right center, however you want to. There's a huge spectrum of Muslims amongst the billion-plus Muslims in the world, and anyway, that is the problem with Bill Maher, not pointing out that religion, faith is irrational and based on nonsense. That part I don't have any problem with, and kind of a extension of that is when Bill Maher has his panel on, and this is the clip that has John Cleese in it. John Cleese has been one of my favorite comic actors for many, many years. I remember when I was in a high school drama class, that our drama teacher asked us all to say who was our favorite comedic actor, and this is back in the early 80s, I must say, I guess. And I mentioned John Cleese. No one who knew who he was, but I guess if I'd said Monty Python, people probably would have known even back in those ancient days. But here's Bill Maher and John Cleese talking about the Pope, and Bill Maher's starting off talking about how the Pope is actually closer to Rick Santorum on a lot of issues, and some liberals are kind of overlooking that, but it's really true. And anyway, I'll talk about it a little more if you watch that second and last clip on the Pope's visit here.
Okay, so what else? Oh, the Pope is against all forms of abortion, ruled out women priests. That sounds more like Rick Santorum than Bernie Sanders.
Indeed.
And also, I must say, you know, gosh, I was watching the TV all week, and first I see the Pope, and they spent, it seemed like days, I know it wasn't, on MSNBC talking about the fact that when he blesses the crowd, he doesn't have to bless you directly for you to get it. It's like Wi-Fi, you know.
Shotgun.
And then like in the next thing they care, and there's 700 people trampled to death in Mecca, which seems to happen to a varying degree every year. And I know you're an atheist. I think you are. Yeah. I hope you are.
Yes.
I know I am. Can we all just agree and then go on to the Pope is great? Religion, stupid, dangerous, pointless, just fucks everything up. Okay.
Can I say, well, I think organized religion fucks everything up.
What about disorganized religion, no?
I think there's some interesting stuff out there.
Like what?
But it's
Like
certainly, what?
Like what?
Well, the mystics. I think that they do have experiences, and they might be more than just a psychological experience. But the trouble is, those guys aren't interested in power, so they never finish up running anything. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
Yeah,
That's
so we
right.
never hear the interesting bit. The rest of it is put forward by organization. I mean, if the teaching of Jesus Christ is about anything, it's about trying to get your own ego under control. Are you listening, Donald?
No, he's not. No, he's not.
Definitely
Not listening, no.
I love it. John Cleese takes a slam at Donald Trump. Very little Trump coverage, but that was worth covering. Like I said, John Cleese has been one of my favorites for a long time. I've seen him not just in Monty Python, but was he in the movie Silverado? He was in the movie Fish Called Wanda. He's anyway, I'm a big John Cleese fan, and so I had to include that clip in the show, and especially with him taking that swipe at Donald Trump after all that talk about the ridiculousness of religion, which was something Monty Python was always great at showing. But like I said, I just wanted to show those two sort of anti-Pope coverage clips because I think the Pope got way too much coverage. While while the Pope was here, the president of China, what's his name, Xi Jinping, I'm probably mispronouncing that, he was here and he met with Obama, and then tomorrow President Obama is meeting with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. That got almost no coverage. The only place it got any coverage at all was over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where guest host Martha Raddatz gave kind of a report first on Putin and some of the problems with Putin, and how maybe this meeting tomorrow between Obama and Putin will, maybe it will bring some more clarity to some of the problems, and then there's a brief mention of China over in this clip.
About, for the first time in nearly a year, President Obama and Vladimir Putin are set to meet face-to-face tomorrow, and for each side, there are some critical issues at stake.
On the agenda at the Putin-Obama meeting, Russia's buildup of troops in Ukraine and Russian aircraft in Syria, where Putin is helping to prop up one of America's most hated dictators, Bashar al-Assad's regime. Putin speaking through a translator in a new interview with CBS 60 Minutes.
There's no other solution to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the effective government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism.
Putin looking to get back on the global stage, even calling gay rights activist Elton John to smooth things over after a prank call on Russian television, Putin telling the singer he's ready to meet with him. But Putin's biggest impact is in Syria, where the Russian military now has dozens of aircraft on the ground, a troubling development for the U.S.
As long as Assad is in power, Syria will remain a magnet for terrorism.
President Obama's own strategy in Syria is coming under fire this week by one of the administration's former top military commanders, General David Petraeus, the former CIA chief, suggesting creating safe havens in Syria protected by American and coalition air power where moderate forces could be trained and refugees could find shelter. Obama already criticized in Congress after the administration revealed a $500 million training program to fight ISIS in Syria has yielded only a few fighters.
We're talking four or five.
Meanwhile, a landmark visit to the U.S. from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Cybersecurity was the headline in talks with President Obama, who took a tough stance on China's history of electronic espionage. Both leaders vowed to cooperate more on security and climate issues, but a lack of trust remains.
The question now is, are words followed by actions?
And let's...
President of China Xi Jinping. I should be able to pronounce that because that's actually probably the most important meeting that President Obama had this week, despite the wall-to-wall Pope coverage, and there was no coverage other than what I showed in a question from an interview with the House Intelligence Committee Chair Dennis Nunes that I'm not going to show. That's the only two mentions of China in all the 5 corporate media news programs this morning. And then there was that Russia-Putin stuff, and that's followed up by Martha Raddatz in an interview with the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, where you'll see Martha Raddatz asks her if this meeting with Putin tomorrow means that the policy of isolating Putin isn't working, and I'm not sure I completely buy her answer that it shows that it was working and that Putin's reaching out, and we have to test that over in this clip.
Great to be here. So Putin has seized Crimea. He's propping up Assad. His fighter jets have been buzzing U.S. and NATO planes and ships. Why is the president meeting with him? Does he think isolating him has failed?
Well, isolating him has had profound effects, as you know, on Russia's economy and his own sense of stature on the international stage, which I think is why he's reaching out in a whole host of ways. That is, President Putin's reaching out. A hallmark of President Obama's foreign policy from the beginning has been to test engagement. And given the stakes, the human stakes, the strategic stakes of what's going on in Ukraine and Syria, the president believed it would be irresponsible to let this occasion in which the two leaders would be in the same city pass without trying to test to see whether progress could be made on these seemingly intractable crises.
Given what's happening,
I mean, I don't really have any problem with there being a meeting, but what Ambassador Samantha Power is saying there about how this means Vladimir Putin is reaching out, that part, I find that a little hard to believe, but maybe there'll be some more coverage I'm sure there will be more coverage of the meeting between Putin and Obama tomorrow, so we can look forward to seeing whether Putin is reaching out or not. And the final clip, so last week I showed several clips about how Bill Maher displayed his Islamophobia with this social media sensation Ahmed Mohamed, who was arrested and suspended from school for bringing in a clock that several people sent me links, and I've seen stuff about how the clock was actually an old Radio Shack digital clock that he opened up and put inside a pencil box, which I don't think as a 14-year-old, even as a 14-year-old calling that an invention, I don't think is outside the realm of honesty, because if you like tinker with stuff and take stuff apart and put it back together, my daughter is close to that age, and I don't, if she called that inventing, I wouldn't think that would be dishonest. And Bill Maher talked about that, and that's not the clip I want to show. The clip I want to show is Ron Reagan making the argument to Bill Maher that I made in my broadcast last week, which I will discuss after you watch that final 1-minute clip for tonight here.
Didn't deserve to be arrested. Okay. But they did absolutely do the right thing, thinking that it could be a bomb. I thought we had zero tolerance for no safety in the school.
If you can get expelled for drawing a picture of a gun, I think you can be detained for bringing something that looks like a bomb to school.
But it didn't look like a bomb. It looked like a clock.
It looked exactly like a bomb.
Have you not seen Die Hard movies? That looks exactly like a bomb.
No, here's the thing about bombs, right? They have the little timer that's the clock part, and then those wires that come out, they're attached to fissile material that explodes.
Okay.
That was the, missing element in this bomb.
Excuse me, Ron.
The thing that blows up. Nothing blew up.
I don't notice all that when I see that hunk of metal there.
When you see a clock?
You know what, Ron? Try to take that through airport security tomorrow and see if they take it.
No, I think you could. It's a clock.
It's
a clock.
It's a clock only because we were told it was a clock. And by the way, it's only the guts of a clock.
So you notice how Bill Maher started out his argument by saying it looks exactly like a bomb, and then when Ron Reagan points out, well, it's not hooked up to an explosive, though he says fissile material, and what I was saying last week is if you look at any bomb, you know, it's hooked up to maybe canisters of liquid or maybe bricks of plastique or who knows, you know, what kind of explosive, but it's got to be some kind of explosive because if there isn't, what part's left? The clock part, and that's kind of what Ron Reagan was pointing out there. And so he started off saying it's exactly like a clock, and then by the end he's saying, well, I don't notice that when I'm looking at, you know, it's only a clock because we were told it's a clock. And the point is, it's really fear from ignorance. If you don't know what a bomb looks like, but you think that you have a right to be afraid of something because your ignorance makes you think a clock looks like a bomb, that's not a good argument to me. And that, you know, that's what Islamophobia is. It's fear that comes from ignorance about the wide spectrum of people who look at those texts and come to a different interpretations, just like in all religions. I think I made a video a long time ago. It's one of my many, many unmonetized videos about Saddam Hussein, showing the worst of the Judeo-Christian Islamo tradition or something like that. Maybe I didn't put a link down to it as a recorded show, as a live show, but as a recorded show, maybe I'll put a link down in the video description. And that brings me to the end of the show, you know, because in that old video I make the same argument that people bring to religion what they have in them, in their hearts to begin with, and it's not religion that makes good people good or bad people bad, and or good people bad or bad people good. It's, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. And the fact that that's an unmonetized video brings me to the part of the show where I ask those of you who can't just watch, or who can do more than just watch or comment and share my videos, but who want to actually help me in some financial sense. If you click on this little eye up in the left-hand corner, you'll see up in the top part, there's a little part where you can give me a direct donation through YouTube fan fundraising, or in like most of this bottom part, you click on that and you can become one of my patrons. I really appreciate, I have almost 50 patrons who are pledging me $300 a month. I'd really like to see that go up to $400 a month, because I do this about 4 times a month, and that would be like $100 just for my live shows, which often have problems with monetization, like that old Saddam Hussein Islamophobia video. But anyway, I want to finish up the show for you all. I want to check out the peak of this eclipse, which I was trying to finish up the show for that. If you can help me out by supporting my videos beyond the ad revenue I get from YouTube when they decide to monetize my videos, I'd appreciate that. I hope you appreciate the 8 to 10 hours I spent putting the show together, picking the clips out, finding the ones I thought would be most informative for you, leave you understanding most what the corporate media thinks is important here in the United States. I'll also try to get up some kind of edited, produced video this week. And as always, I'll be back next Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific time, which is Greenwich Mean Time minus 7 hours, or somewhere right around there. Usually I start within about 10 minutes of that time. And until then, I guess I'll be seeing all of you around the internet.